It is 1996 in Kigali, Rwanda. Inside a dimly lit living room, while the rain hammers against the tin roof, a man sits frozen in his chair.
His name is Paul Rusesabagina. To the outside world, he is already becoming a legend, a living saint who managed the Hotel Rwanda during the darkest 100 days of the country. He saved 1,268 people from slaughter, making him a hero. After the success of the movie Hotel Rwanda, 2004, Paul became a celebrity. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from George W. Bush in 2005. However, in the years to come, the specific details of his heroism would be furiously contested by the very regime that now governs the streets outside his window. But on this night, he sits there laboring under the dangerous illusion that this reputation is a shield. He believes that his status as a hero in the West has bought him immunity from the new powers in the East. He is gravely mistaken. This is the story of the two sides of Hotel Rwanda hero, a man who saved lives or a villain who fueled a war? According to his own memoir, the silence of the house is shattered when the front door bursts open, revealing a soldier of the ruling party standing in the threshold with the rain whipping around him. As the soldier levels his pistol at Paul's chest, it becomes clear that this is an execution in the making. To understand why a soldier was standing in Paul Rusesabagina's living room with a pistol, you have to understand the one thing the new Rwandan government valued above all else: the narrative. In 1996, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF, had just seized control of the country. They were the rebel army that had stopped the genocide. Their legitimacy to rule was built on a single absolute truth: we are the heroes who ended the slaughter. But Paul Rusesabagina was a problem. He was a Hutu man who had saved Tutsis. And worse, he was beginning to tell a version of the story that terrified the new regime. While the RPF was trying to project an image of disciplined liberators, Paul was witnessing something else. From the windows of the Hotel Rwanda and later from the streets of Kigali, he saw the liberators dragging civilians away in the night. He began to ask the most dangerous question you can ask in post-genocide Rwanda: who is punishing the RPF crimes? To the government, this was not just criticism, it was moral equivalence. It was an insult to the memory of the dead. The hatred was personal and it was deep. They didn't just want him quiet because he was annoying. They wanted him dead because he threatened their monopoly on the truth. He was a living witness to the gray areas in a black and white war. So when the soldier kicked open the door that night in 1996, it wasn't a random act of violence. It was a sanitized operation. The regime had decided that the hero of the hotel had to be erased before his version of history could take root. But Paul instinctively reverts to the only skill that kept him alive during the genocide. He negotiates. Desperate to buy his life, he empties his pockets and pulls hidden francs from drawers, piling the currency onto the floor in a frantic bid for survival. The soldier hesitates, his eyes weighing the certainty of the immediate cash against the abstract order to kill, and eventually greed wins out. He sweeps up the money and vanishes back into the storm. Paul knew that luck is a resource you cannot spend twice, but Paul had one card left to play: his employer. The Hotel Rwanda, aka Hotel Rwanda, was owned by Sabena, the Belgian national airline. While the Rwandan government wanted him dead, the corporation wanted their manager alive. Under the cover of darkness, he packs his family into a car and speeds towards the airport. Armed with work visas expedited by headquarters in Brussels, he bluffed his way through the checkpoints. He boarded a commercial flight, fleeing to Belgium not as a refugee, but as a corporate transfer. He believed he was escaping a rogue soldier. He flees to Belgium believing he is escaping a single, isolated assassination attempt, unaware that he has just fired the opening shot of a 25-year war against an entire government. However, the Rwandan government tells a radically different story. To the RPF, the assassination attempt is a fabrication, a dramatic lie invented to justify his departure and burnish his credentials as a victim. Official records from Kigali suggest that Paul left Rwanda freely, without coercion, primarily to pursue business interests in Belgium. From the government's perspective, Paul's departure wasn't about safety, it was about ideology. They argue that by 1996, Paul was already drifting into the orbit of genocide negationists, political groups formed by the perpetrators of the genocide who had fled into the Congo. When Paul speaks of RPF crimes, the government does not hear a human rights activist. They hear the echo of the double genocide theory. This is the controversial idea that equates the RPF's strategic warfare with the exterminationist intent of the Hutu Interahamwe. To the government, Paul was not a refugee fleeing violence. He was an opportunist fleeing accountability, taking his fame with him to weaponize it against the state. By the early 2000s, Paul has settled into the quiet, gray suburbs of Brussels, 4,000 miles away from the hills of Rwanda. But for Paul, the safety of Belgium eventually revealed itself to be a lie. The paranoia didn't wash over him all at once. It accumulated in the small, jagged edges of his daily routine. He started checking his rearview mirror more than the road ahead. He began to notice the same gray sedan idling at the corner of his street, the driver's face always obscured by shadow. The telephone in his hallway became an instrument of terror. He would lift the receiver only to hear the hollow, rhythmic breathing of a stranger on the other end, listening just long enough to let Paul know he was there. Then the surveillance moved from the shadows to his doorstep. Paul stood at his kitchen window and watched as a moving truck backed into the driveway of the large estate directly bordering his garden. He watched as men unloaded furniture, but his eyes were drawn to what they installed on the roof. High-grade, long-range security cameras. They were pointed at his patio. He soon realized his new neighbor was not a wealthy Belgian banker looking for a quiet life. Paul realized that a senior Rwandan diplomat had moved into the house next door. Investigative reporting by outlets like Forbidden Stories and EU Observer would later link this pressure to a man named Gustave Antoine Mueto. While his official title was first secretary at the embassy, Gustave was identified in reports as a senior operative for the Directorate of Military Intelligence, a veteran of the brutal Congo Wars who was not sent to Brussels to stamp visas, but because he understood the utility of fear. Gustave isn't there to arrest Paul, which would cause a diplomatic scandal. He's there to dismantle him psychologically. He wants him to know that when he breaks bread with his family, the regime is at the table. He wants him to realize that he isn't living in a home, but in a fishbowl. The psychological pressure eventually escalates into physical intrusion. Paul returns home one evening to find his study ransacked, drawers pulled out and papers scattered across the floor. Yet on the desk, a stack of cash sits clearly visible. They had taken only documents, files written in Kinyarwanda, which is the national language of Rwanda, political drafts, and contact lists. The message Gustave left behind was louder than any death threat. "We don't want your money, we want your mind." Terrified by the realization that the walls of his sanctuary had been breached, Paul flees across the Atlantic to San Antonio, Texas. He believes the United States offers a firewall that Rwanda cannot penetrate, but he had simply traded a physical hunter for a legal one. But once again, we must look at this through the lens of the Rwandan state. The government in Kigali has vehemently and consistently denied these allegations. They dismiss the stories of Gustave and the break-ins as conspiracy theories pushed by a man desperate to remain relevant. They point to a crucial fact. The Belgian police opened a file on the break-ins, investigated the scene, and eventually closed the case without ever identifying a perpetrator. There was no forensic link to the embassy. There was no proof of the neighbor's involvement. To the RPF, the narrative of the stalking spy is a delusion of grandeur. However, the government does not deny that they were interested in Paul. By this time, they viewed him not as a retired hotel manager, but as an active security threat. From their perspective, Paul was using his comfortable life in Brussels to fundraise for regime change. If intelligence agents were monitoring him, the state argues it was not harassment, it was national security. They believed he was communicating with armed groups dedicated to destabilizing Rwanda. In the eyes of Kigali, keeping tabs on a man who openly calls for the overthrow of the government is not a crime, it is the duty of the state. For 2 decades, this war was fought with words. Paul wrote memoirs and gave speeches in lecture halls. The government issued statements and diplomatic protests. The regime had grown tired of the stalemate. They decided to deploy a more sophisticated weapon: the law. The man tasked with closing the net was Aimable Havugiyaremye, a prosecutor general who represents the new face of Rwanda, not a soldier in muddy boots, but a technocrat in a tailored suit who operates with cold, bureaucratic logic. Aimable knew that he could not extradite Paul Rusesabagina from the United States on charges of defamation or genocide denial. The West views such rhetoric as protected free speech. He needed a crime that no Western government could ignore. He needed to prove terrorism. And in 2018, Paul gave him the opening he needed. Paul helped found the MRCD, the Rwandan Movement for Democratic Change. It was a coalition of opposition groups, but it was not merely a political party. It had an armed wing known as the FLN, the National Liberation Front. To Paul and his supporters, the FLN was a necessary evolution of the resistance. They argued that the RPF had closed all political space, rigged elections, and silenced dissent. When a government makes peaceful change impossible, they reasoned, it makes violent revolution inevitable. Paul viewed himself as a voice for the voiceless, supporting a liberation movement against tyranny. But on the ground in Rwanda, the FLN's actions looked very different. In 2018 and 2019, the FLN launched a series of attacks in the Nyungwe forest near the border of Burundi. These were not honorable duels between soldiers. The rebels ambushed public buses. They set fire to vehicles. During these incursions, 9 civilians were killed, and many others were injured. This is the hardest reality to reconcile. While Paul was in San Antonio, Texas, recording videos in a suit and tie, innocent Rwandans were dying in the fire of grenades. The prosecutor general began to assemble his case. He found a video Paul posted to YouTube in late 2018, where he looked into the camera and declared, "The time for political means is over." He pledged his unreserved support to the FLN. To the prosecutor, this was not a metaphor, it was a confession of command responsibility. Furthermore, the prosecution obtained Western Union receipts. They alleged that thousands of dollars had flowed from Paul's Texas bank account directly to rebel commanders in the Congo and Burundi. While Paul's family would later argue this money was for humanitarian aid or social assistance, the government claimed the funds were used to purchase satellite phones and supplies for the insurgents. The RPF's position was absolute. You cannot live in a mansion in America, order attacks that kill villagers in Rwanda, and then hide behind a Hollywood medal. They didn't see a hero, they saw a terrorist financier. Despite the receipts and the videos, the United States and Belgium refused to extradite Paul. The legal firewall held. Prosecutor Aimable realized he could win the case in court, but he could never get the defendant into the chair. So the mission objective shifted from extradition to infiltration. The Rwandan intelligence services initiated a plan that would blur the lines between justice and kidnapping. They looked for the one thing the law cannot protect: trust. They focused on a man named Constantine Niwantushe. To Paul, Constantine was a bishop, a fellow man of God, a friend who had broken bread at his table. Paul trusted him. But unbeknownst to Paul, Constantine was working with the Rwandan Investigation Bureau. The government claims Constantine was a willing informant who had realized the violent nature of Paul's plans. Paul's supporters claim Constantine was coerced or bribed. Regardless of the motivation, the bishop contacted Paul with a script. He didn't ask Paul to come for a war council. He asked him to come to Burundi to speak to the churches. It appealed to Paul's sense of duty and perhaps his vanity. But Paul was still cautious. He knew the region was dangerous. And this is where the bishop played the ace. He told Paul that a private charter had been arranged, a Bombardier Challenger 605. He sold it as a miracle, a gift from a wealthy benefactor within the church. In reality, the benefactor was the Rwandan government. They paid the charter company, GainJet, roughly $100,000 for the flight. On August 27, 2020, Paul steps out of a black car at Dubai International Airport. He walks up the stairs of the jet, settling into the cream leather seats. As the jet climbs into the night sky, Paul clinks glasses with his friend, believing he is flying to Bujumbura, Burundi. But while Paul sleeps, the pilot follows a different flight plan. The aircraft banks sharply, turning away from the safety of Burundi and heading straight into the heart of the regime Paul has spent 25 years escaping. When the landing gear drops, Paul wakes up. He looks out the window, expecting the dark rural airstrip of Bujumbura. Instead, he sees the glittering modern skyline of Kigali. He turns to the bishop and asks, "Where are we?" The pastor does not answer. The Rwandan government views this not as a kidnapping, but as a masterpiece of intelligence work, a sting operation. They argue that luring a fugitive into a jurisdiction where they can be arrested is a standard tactic used by the FBI and Mossad. They emphasize that Paul voluntarily boarded the plane with the intention of meeting armed rebels. He brought himself to justice. But to Paul and to legal scholars around the world, it was a violation of international law. He was snatched from safety through deception, a civilian trick that bypassed all extradition treaties. As the cabin door opened and the cool night air of Rwanda rushed in, agents of the intelligence service boarded the plane. The hero of the hotel was in handcuffs. The trial that followed was a spectacle of high tension. Paul, dressed in the pink uniform of a Rwandan prisoner, stood before the High Court Chamber for International Crimes. The government's argument was that no man is above the law, regardless of how many medals he has won. They sought to prove that Paul was the president of the MRCD and therefore criminally liable for every bullet fired by the FLN. Paul, however, rejected the legitimacy of the court. He argued that he was a Belgian citizen who'd been illegally abducted. Midway through the trial, he announced he would no longer participate in a process he considered a sham. In September 2021, the verdict was read. Paul Rusesabagina was found guilty of terrorism, arson, and murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. It seemed the weary historian's story would end in a concrete cell. But the war against Paul was being fought on two fronts: in the courtroom in Kigali and in the diplomatic corridors of Washington, D.C. The United States government designated Paul as wrongfully detained. The pressure on Rwanda began to mount. For over 900 days, negotiations took place behind closed doors. Finally, in March 2023, a breakthrough was reached. The Rwandan government agreed to commute Paul's sentence. As part of the deal, Paul wrote a letter to President Paul Kagame. In it, he expressed regret for any violence committed by the FLN, though he stopped short of admitting personal criminal intent. On a warm morning in March, Paul Rusesabagina was driven to the home of the Qatari ambassador in Kigali, and from there, flown back to the United States. He returns to Texas a free man, yet the chasm between the two truths remains unbridged. To his family and supporters, Paul is a survivor of a vindictive dictatorship, a man who refused to bow down, was hunted across the globe, and survived the gulag of the regime he dared to criticize. To the Rwandan government and the victims of the Nyungwe attacks, justice was only partially served. They see a wealthy man who funded terror, used his fame to evade consequences, and was only released because of the geopolitical weight of the United States. The story of Paul Rusesabagina is no longer just about a hotel in 1994. It is a story about the messy, complicated, and often contradictory nature of post-conflict justice.
It forces us to ask, can a man be a hero in one chapter of history and a villain in the next? And who gets to decide which version of the truth survives?